I didn't know we were here to resolve issues. Oh man,
I feel like that was a complete mischaracterization. I never said anything remotely close to the idea.
that's kind of fucked up.
Sure.
I don't think you'd be chill with that. Now maybe.
While panels make for great entertainment, they oftentimes obfuscate issues, and they're poorly moderated and typically boil down to quick aphorisms, slick dunks, and are replete with interruptions. While I've always been a fan of Destiny, some of his takes are frustrating, and on countless occasions I feel I've been mistreated and sometimes even outright disrespected. While at times Destiny and I have had somewhat pleasant interactions, at other times his interactions have led to unfounded labels by his community, DGG, and I think this is an opportunity to communicate in person and clear the air on a few things and really address some of the statements that have been made and that have begun to permeate DGG. You smirked a bit there. Did that intro catch you off guard a little bit?
I didn't know we were here to resolve issues. Oh man.
It's not. There's no major issues. You know, we've always had.
Well, that's what you think. I don't
interactions.
know. We're gonna find out now.
Well, yeah,
We're gonna
you
dig
let me
into
know,
it
for sure. I think I'm pretty transparent. So
Okay.
yeah. All right. So I guess probably the most important issue I would say is at one point we've had various conversations about like black issues and things like that, and I think on some of them you eventually kind of labeled me as racist.
Yeah.
It happened. So we got to kind of walk through that. And the thing that sucked about it is I felt like that conversation happened primarily from a panel, right? And obviously in a panel, we're not getting back and forth. And even when we are, it's really heated because there's going to be interruptions and nobody moderates panels almost at all.
No, listen,
Hold on. No. Can I just finish? I can't even finish. Yeah, please go ahead and read me some more, dude. Would you ask me another big question? Okay. So no. Okay. You guys have me sound like a communist here, okay? The idea that people are like hyper target. I'm not. Fuck off. You don't even know what the fuck a communist is, okay?
I wouldn't. So I would never tell them that they're not allowed to, but I would say that they.
Okay, I'm not saying not allowed to. Sure. No. I just like. I didn't know that in such a short time we would be people on the left would be arguing against interracial dating. I don't know.
I don't know that. Number one, I'm not arguing against interracial dating because again, you keep doing this mischaracterization thing. You should probably stop that. So I'm not saying that other people can't date of people that are racist. I'm not saying other black people can't date people of the.
Well, you were making it sound like it would be misguided if white people. Hold on, you made it. You said.
So with that being said. I think the beginning of the thing that led you to this kind of mentality or this conclusion was about the dating thing, about me wanting to date a black person. Okay, now do you feel like that is inherently racist?
No.
Okay, so what tell me what would make that racist and where there would be something that would disqualify it as being racist?
The reasoning can be racist.
Okay.
So if I were to say something like, I probably want to date like a white person because I generally find that they look better to me or whatever, I think that's okay. But if I were to say I really want to date a white person because I don't want to run the risk of like my kid's mom being a crack dealer at some point, probably not okay.
Sure.
Probably a little more racist. So I think it depends on like the rationale.
Okay.
And it felt like the rationale for you wanting to date a black woman is because one, you assume a shared experience that isn't necessarily going to be there because they're black, and two, you made it sound like the children of mixed, or the parents of mixed children can't provide as good a life for their children because they don't have the same perspective that somebody growing up in the United States as black would have, which I thought was kind of suspect, a little weird.
Okay, so regarding because a black person is black, they're going to have a shared experience. I obviously disagree with that, right? Clearly, like I think you brought up Candace Owens. She's clearly not going to have a shared experience. There's God knows how many like black Gothics and I are probably not going to have shared experiences or at least shared outlooks. Ironically, in both of those cases, neither one of them are foundational black Americans, right? Like Gothics is from like Cape Verdean and I forget where Candace Owens is. Like she's some sort of immigrant. Her parents are like, immigrants. So there's already going to be like a distinct situation there. But even still, even within black families, there's going to be some black people who are going to have entirely different experiences. But I would say that the thing that I was definitely focusing on was the idea that the lived experience of like systemic oppression and things like that being directed at you, having like lived it, I think it gives you a specific insight. And that insight, I think is something that I wanted to highlight. And it wasn't just all form just having experienced oppression. I think it's specifically, about having internalized racism, which is something that black people tend to experience and express in various ways. That specific experience for me was really like, I'll say harmful very painful like revelation when I realized, wow, I've been really perpetuating this. And so, and I began to question and talk to more people about it, and I learned how common or even endemic this was to black culture, to blackness. And so then me realizing that, it gave me a specific focus on wanting to eliminate that or like not allow that to happen to my children. And so it gave me, and I felt like because this was something that I was particularly strong about, I felt like it was important for me to find someone who also has experienced it from their perspective. So then that way it would be very easy to highlight or to recognize if it was present in children. Does that make sense?
I understand what you're saying. I just disagree.
Wait, you don't think that a person who has experienced something is more likely to be able to recognize
I don't
it
think
in other
today
people?
in the United States, for the vast majority of black Americans, I don't think that experience is so far removed from the average experience that you wouldn't be able to like empathetically understand somebody's position there.
You might be able to empathize, but do you not think that having a specific experience with something gives you probably more of an insight than other people who are empathizing?
It does, but I don't think you should build your life around that.
Sure. I don't think my goal is never to build my entire life around it. I think there's so many other things that matter. Obviously, I want someone who shares my religious values. Obviously, I want somebody who's musically inclined. I want somebody who shares some of the same social values as me.
But if you found somebody that matched every dimension, but they were like Asian or Hispanic or white, you'd be like, nope, sorry, gotta move on. That just seems like a really hard buy to me. I think there were a lot of unique things in my life growing up related to being Catholic. And I remember that I met somebody, the last time I was in Seattle, I was hanging out with a girl and she had a lot of those same things. And I didn't realize how much we could connect on, from weird things we did in church to going to like an all boys or all girls school, to the weird things your parents would say, to like the types of Christian rock bands, and then the Christian post-hardcore things like Emery and Under Oath. Like I didn't realize like, oh shit, a lot of these were like Catholic. Wait, am I allowed to cuss here?
Yeah, you're fine.
Okay. That a lot of these are like Catholic experiences. And I thought it was really cool to relate to the person like that. And I was like, oh, maybe this is like a bigger part of my life than I thought. But I would never take the next step and be like, I'm only going to date somebody from that background. Because I think that's a really important part of me to understand.
Okay. But if someone did take that stance, if someone believed this is something that's rather important to me, and I do believe that if I'm looking for someone who's going to be able to recognize this as keenly as possible, the idea that like I would likely be able to find that in a black person, I think that's. Would you say that that's well founded?
I don't think it should be that important.
Got you. Do you think it's well founded that I would likely be able to find this in a black person?
More likely than a white person, for sure, yeah.
Okay. And so, because I think, for example, you can look and say, I'm really hoping to find someone who really values education, right? And recognizes the need for that so that we can like inculcate our children with like educational importance as one of their like chief values. You can find a person with a PhD that doesn't really particularly think that it was incredibly important, that has gone sour on it and says, oh, this is important. But the idea is that an educated person is more likely to see education as valuable and therefore be more likely to be able to instill that value into your children, right?
More likely, yeah, I agree.
Right. And so I think whenever you're dealing with the human beings, you're not going to be able to find absolutes. And so I don't think there's ever a point where I would ever be as foolish as to say something like, well, only a black person would be able to instill this and all black people will be able to instill this. But I do think it's reasonable to say that I think it's extremely more likely to be able to find black people that can identify it. And I think there's so it's hard to ever say something in absolutes when it comes to things like dating, right? Because I think everyone who's single, you come up with these kind of ideals in your head of, I want this. And as you start dating, as time goes on, I think sometimes desperation can get in. Settlement has to happen on some things. No person is going to be perfectly ideal, right? And so eventually you start kind of encountering things where it's like, I genuinely believed that this would be my chief goal, but if something really came along that was checking off every box but just wasn't black, it's like, dang, this is a compromise I'm going to have to make. I found the actual love of my life. And I think it's reasonable to say that while also recognizing that my goal at this point is specifically to date someone black. And one other major point is I think that the idea that someone who is black is specifically going to be able to have these experiences is not rooted in the idea that like it's because they're black. It's because of the black experience within this country. And so this isn't something that would be like almost like race essentialism or anything like that. It would be related to the experiences that black people are having within this country. And so in that sense, I don't think there would be anything racist about that. It would be something that would be environmental. And if situation was reversed such that white people were experiencing like some sort of like crazy harm or some sort of like internalized racism because they were constantly actively being demonized, and we were starting to notice that endemic within young white children is this sort of rejection or whatever of their whiteness or some sort of diminutive like outlook towards their race, then maybe I would probably make the same argument for them. I can understand why they would say, given these circumstances, I think it's important to find someone who's able to identify and recognize this thing so as to make sure that we're able to combat it from the child from the beginning, right?
Okay.
Do you feel like
I understand what you're saying. When you back off the absolute part of that, I am much more likely to agree. I think it's totally possible for somebody to be like, I think I want to date somebody that is like me in this way. So I'm kind of looking for that. But I think that statement is way different than I would only date somebody of this skin color. And I understand maybe the underlying rationale might be similar. But I think that when you make the absolute statement, it feels less like we're looking for the experience and more like we're making some like essentialist race argument that like I could only ever be with somebody of this race because they're the only type of person that could understand me. But the desire to like date somebody with a shared set of experiences, I don't think that's necessarily the worst thing in the world. I think that's probably okay.
Sure. And then regarding the mixed thing, I feel like that was a complete mischaracterization. I never said anything remotely close to the idea that like, oh, mixed parents won't be able to provide whatever. I have.
Well, it sounded like what you said basically was that you wanted to be able to educate your child about things related to the black experience in the United States. And if you were dating somebody that wasn't black, then that parent wouldn't be able to connect with the child.
No.
Okay.
Because it's not about just being able to educate people about the black experience. Anyone can learn about the black experience. But specifically, my whole point the entire time was identifying self-hatred. And I think it's really hard for a white person to be able to identify self-hatred or, anti-black self-hatred, right?
I feel like it's pretty easy.
I mean,
I don't think it's that difficult. As long as you're like willing to be somewhat of an empathetic person, I think you can understand a lot of it like decently, no?
I don't think so, because I think when I talk to other black people about it, very often we don't recognize it in ourselves.
It wouldn't surprise me. This is going to sound very white, but it wouldn't surprise me if it was more likely to happen in some types of like white liberal communities versus like the black community at large, because depending on where you're living at in the black community, it's probably not the types of conversations you're having, depending on like, because you have to probably hit a certain level. It's going to sound weird to say this, but you probably have to get to a certain level of privilege to care about things like self-hatred. And if you're not at that level, you're more concerned with like surviving than like thinking about things like this.
I mean, possibly, but I think the fact that it's not like a common conversation, it's not something that most people identify. I think I'm a pretty hyper introspective person in general. And I think to be 35 years old and finally coming to the realization that this is something that I've been perpetuating and experiencing. And then like my current girlfriend right now, she was experiencing the exact same thing. Like, and she was 37 when it finally clicked for her. Like, whoa, this is something I've been perpetuating. And
I feel like
that experience is not uncommon.
For sure. I think these have been pretty big conversations in the black community for decades, for quite a long time.
What, internalized racism?
Like, what does it mean to be black? And like, what does it mean to act black? I think it's like a really complicated conversation. I know that Bill Cosby talked about it a lot historically. He got a lot of heat for, are you familiar with the pound cake speech? Yeah.
Pull your pants up and stuff.
Basically, yeah. Like, well, why was the kid there, you know? I know that, like, rappers
and That was like 2012, though, wasn't it?
Was it 2012?
I want to say it was around then. The pound cake? The pound cake speech?
It might have been.
It was around that
That's
time.
still like 10 years ago, right?
Sure.
Going farther back than that, you know, like, activists and rappers have gone back and forth. I know Jay-Z has fought with like Jesse Jackson and stuff over like should swear words be in rap music and everything, and I think Jay-Z is like, okay, well, listen.
I don't think that's not a question of what does it mean to be black.
Well, the issue is that like so
neither is the pound cake thing.
What? Well, so I think kind of I think that a lot of it ties together. So I think that the issue is like if you are black and you want to be successful, what does it mean to be like a successful black person? Because it felt like for a while in the black community, basically it was to kind of like become white. So on the man side, being successful as a black person means getting a really hot white woman. Or some people might say, well, when you talk a certain way as you're black, you're like code switching. You're trying to sound white. Why are you trying to do that, right? And then others might argue, well, hold on. Just because I'm trying to sound educated doesn't mean that I'm not being black. Like sounding like a street person, that's not intrinsic to the black experience. So there's like a lot of like back and forth on that. On the woman's side, especially the older singers like Beyonce, Alicia Keys, like being a successful black woman meant like almost like looking white. You would lighten your hair, you would straighten the fuck out of it all the time, and you'd be kind of like white presenting. Sometimes like you'd Photoshop your skin to be a little bit lighter. So I think there's always been these like back and forth conversations on like what does it mean to be a successful black person, like without being like a sellout, or like are you acting white or are you just acting like black educated? Like I'm not saying that. Yeah, I'm just saying I think that conversation has been part of black communities for probably quite a while, probably since like the 60s, I would guess, if not.
That's a conversation you can have that's 100% independent of the internalized racism conversation.
Well, I think like the way that it would play into the internalized racism is the idea that like so like for a black woman, the idea of always thinking that like frizzy hair looks bad and straight hair looks good is kind of like an internalized form of hatred, kind of, because you're saying that like a black like most black women have frizzy hair. It's like that's bad, and like so that would be like an idea of like an internalized racism. Or for like a black man thinking that like I'm not dating a black woman are crazy, you know, like white women are the goal. That's kind of like a form of like internalized.
So but all of these things, I think a lot of them, we've had conversations about those things, but we've never really like framed it in any capacity to be internalized racism. And I think that framing is important. And again, I think that these conversations are a bit removed because I've been part of those conversations. I've always known about, I've been accused of sounding white and things like that since I was a kid. I intentionally learned to change my speech. But I think even though that's the case, I don't think it never occurred to me that part of my reasoning behind trying to sound this way, as I got older in particular, and the way I was code switching, had specifically to do with internalized racism. And that part of the conversation is almost never reached. We can reach focusing on the expression of what internalized racism is and addressing all of these symptoms. Well, you seem like you only want to date white women, or you're deifying white women in a specific way, or you feel like black hair is whatever, or you know you have this crazy like obsession almost with like super light-skinned black women, right? And you think dark-skinned women or whatever. We've always had these kind of like conversations, but we've never really gotten to the understanding that these are evidence of internalized racism. And I think that especially like for the obvious like outward expressions, it becomes really obvious. But I think the more you start kind of getting into more internal things, when you start kind of focusing on cultural things, like I guess I got to think of some examples. Music, or things like that, where it's like, man, I where some people are more prone or more like, yeah, they want to listen to specific forms of white music in order to kind of distance themselves from blackness, right? Or white style clothing or things like that, where your entire intention is to distance yourself from blackness because you do see it as something as inferior. I don't think a lot of times we have those conversations. And even when it comes to like the conversation about like black men becoming successful and wanting to date white women, a lot of times like we've always had these conversations of like, why is that? And then there's a talk about, well, I mean, these are the women that are in these successful circles. An NBA player is probably not going to encounter as many black women. I mean, because how many black women are there on the Laker that are Laker girls, right? Or so on and so forth. And so then these pieces start happening. Like the average, obviously, there are more white women in Hollywood than there are outside of it. I mean, there are black women rather. So then with those kinds of conversations, it's always been like, oh, kind of it's circumstances, whatever. But then there are some people who are intentionally seeking out white women because they have this viewpoint that black women are inferior, even though they're black. And I don't think that piece is very much discussed.
Yeah, maybe. I guess the way that it relates is I understand what you're saying. You used a phrase like distancing yourself from your blackness. I guess to figure out what is internalized racism or what are good thoughts is trying to figure out like what is intrinsic to blackness. And I think that's like the challenge or the struggle that some people in minority communities can have.
Sure.
Like if I don't want to act this way, does that make me a sellout or does that make me hate my blackness?
Sure.
How somebody talks is a big back and forth, right? Like why are you trying to talk white? Why are you trying to act white? You know, some people would say, okay, you know, whatever slang you have in the streets is fine. Like Southern men talk with a Southern drawl. People don't say that they're uneducated. So if we want to speak in AAVE or Ebonics, you know, that should be the way that we speak too. People know what we are saying. But then other people will argue, well, hold on, we can't say that speaking in an educated manner is the domain of the white man. That's racist in and of itself. Like black people can speak. So I'm empathetic to like the struggle of finding what is right or what is wrong, because all of this is happening in the context of a white society too, where whiteness is kind of like the default correct. So it's hard to figure out like how can I act in a way like, is me trying to speak better and dress better, does that make me hate my blackness, or am I just trying to distance myself from some ghetto culture that has nothing to do with blackness? Or, yeah, it's a hard one. It's a complicated conversation.
Yeah, and I think, yeah. So that complication, I think, is really difficult. And again, I do think that self-hatred is somewhat endemic within just black culture in general, because I think it's almost impossible not to default to. I know you've seen it, those doll tests where they have like these, like sometimes 3 to 5 year old kids, and then they're asking them like, which of these dolls is the bad kid, and which one, and depending on the shades of darkness, then the kids are more likely to point to these things. So I think some of these things, just because of the way society is structured, I think people are more likely to default to that type of internalized racism, and so. So when upon seeing those kind of things, I had a specific thing because of the fact that my experience was particularly painful. This was something I wanted to highlight, something that I specifically was like, I do not want internalized racism within my children. That, to date, is one of the more painful experiences of mine, because it felt like a self-betrayal.
I guess I understand what you're saying there, and this might just be like a different set of experiences, because I that's all I can draw from, and then listening to other people, I guess. I think I've said this before, but when I grew up, my grandma lived in like these row of townhomes, and for whatever reason, she was in like a black townhome neighborhood. So all of the friends, I didn't know for a long time that like the black people couldn't swim. I didn't know that was like a meme, because like we had like a pool and everything. We went swimming. I'd never known that like black people couldn't swim. I never heard that before. But whenever I would stay the night at those families' households, they were the most conservative people.
Yeah.
I didn't know any rap at the time, so I don't know who he got caught with. But my one friend, his older brother, his dad caught him with it was some rap CD. I don't know. I don't know who it was at the time. He got in so much fucking trouble because his dad's household, it was like a no rap household. They listened to like church music, and I think they could do like the rock stations maybe, but that was a very concerned. And then I knew another friend I had growing up, Vatelin, what is his name? His household was also very, very, very conservative. Like the kids got spanked. You'd clean up for dinner time, like very, very formal. So it's interesting when I hear, as I grew up more, and I hear some people talking about like, oh, well, we need to accept these things in the black communities, etc. My personal experience is that there's like, broadly speaking, I'm generalizing a lot here, but there's like 2 very broad black households. You've got like, sometimes it's like the broken home where there's like a father absent, or there's like a lot of like crime related stuff. And then you've got like the black families that are like, my kids are not going to be like that. And we're going to be the most fucking conservative types of homes. And I feel like when you talk about how I want to date a black person because of these shared experiences, I feel like the black people coming out of those households, the very conservative ones, I don't know if I would say they have internalized racism or not, but they're going to be the ones that are like the hardest against black communities. They're going to be like, my children are not listening to rap. We're not going to dress like thugs. We're not going to do it. We're going to be very proper. We're going to speak proper. No slang in the household or whatever. So I thought that split is kind of interesting to me in terms of like, well, I think that a black person would understand. It's like maybe from a certain area, maybe not.
For sure. And I think, I feel like it's almost like incredulous. It's ridiculous to, I think, to like almost imply that like, no, I'm just saying across the board, all black people are going to qualify, right? Because even when, for example, if you say, I'm interested in women, right? No one's going to immediately say, oh, so this like beluga whale right here, you're interested in her, right? Like, it's like, no, even though I'm saying I'm only interested in women, there's going to be other qualifications that are obviously important. And I think to assume otherwise is, it's just, that's ridiculous, right? Like, there's no way I'm going to sit here and just say every black woman is a candidate. I mean, I'm 37 years old. I'm not married now.
I'll take my racism from like a 4 out of 10 for you to like a 2 out of 10. Okay.
All right. So from that specific thing, from the interracial dating conversation, it's not necessarily about like that portion. My reasoning for that was it wasn't something that was rooted in racism. Okay. Take a small break. Yeah.
Okay.
We're having a discussion just about N-word usage.
Yeah.
And it was a panel, and on panels, I'm just gonna be heated because
of course,
like there's
how we go.
Yeah, that's it. Their entertainment. It's kind of my meme. That's who I am. But it sucks because it's a panel, and we don't really get a really solid back and forth. So, I think it started out. We were talking about you had the opinion basically that pretty much no one should be able to use it, right?
Either nobody or everybody. Yeah,
Nobody or
at
everybody.
this point, yeah.
Okay, and I came up with an analogy, and the analogy was that people within an in-group can obviously use a word, or can say something that's offensive to that in-group, but stepping outside of that group, it's probably going to be viewed as offensive. You don't automatically have this presumption that this person is meaning it with no intention to harm or whatever, right? So, and I came up with the analogy. I was saying basically like someone within a family, right? The identified in group in this situation is a family. So then someone from that family can make jokes about any person in that family, and there's this automatic presumption that this is not meant to be harmful, and so on and so forth. But if someone outside of that family was to make that joke, or whatever, it becomes like harmful. And so, for example, your mama, and that kind of, if I make a your mama joke, the your in that situation means that we're referring to the mom that belongs to that person. And if we're part of the same in-group, we have the same mother, then it's also mine, right? So then we're an in-group.
Okay, that's an interesting example. Yeah, I understand what you're saying.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
So then someone else can also say your mama jokes because the your mama in that situation is a reference to their mom, right? So they can do that. They can't make a joke about my mom. I can't make a joke about their mom because I'm not part of that in-group.
I understand this explanation. I just don't think it applies to the N-word because I don't think that the N-word is ever used as an insult. It's just like a hey, what's up?
Sure, we do all the time.
No. Well, it can be, but that's not the most common usage of it.
I think it's used. It's used pretty commonly both ways. Like if I say I hate this stupid nigga, nigga is not meant to be a term of endearment in that situation.
No, but I don't think it's meant to be like he's an N-word. I think it's meant to be like I hate this guy.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. But so I guess the point being, it's not always meant to be something uplifting. But regardless, when it's being used, it's being used.
So this would be like how I would disagree with this. I think that if you were outside, hanging around on a street corner, and a black guy walked up to you, and he's like, "What the fuck are you loitering at here, you stupid N-word?" And he hard-R'd you, I think you'd be like, "What the fuck?" I think you'd look and you'd be like, "That's kind of fucked up."
Sure.
I don't think you'd be chill with that. Now, maybe it wouldn't be quite the same reaction as like a white person saying it, but I think if a black person hard-R'd you, it would ding a little bit.
I think, so the thing is what's crazy is in that situation, if a black person said that, it would be all of the things leading up to that. Like, what the F are you doing here? Like, that part automatically would be alarming.
Yeah, and I
then
agree.
You stupid
I
N-word,
agree with
the
that,
stupid part-
100%.
But this is wouldn't carry a lot of weight.
Yeah, but like, so this is like where I comment this with like all the context shit. Like, if two white people are like rapping onto a song, or if they see each other, it's like, "Yo, what's up, my brother, ninja," or whatever. Like, who the fuck cares? Like, why? Why does it matter? It just seems like such a dumb thing to even think about.
Okay, so just to make sure, regarding that first point, clearly it wouldn't be the N-word that would be the thing that would be alarming you in that first example. It would be all of the surrounding things and all the things that preceded it. Whereas, and the reaction, while it would probably be adverse again to all those other things. But let's take all that context out. Black person walks by another black person and says the N-word, hard R, right? More often than not, you're going to get a look of surprise, a look of shock, like, what the freak, where'd that come from? And probably an ignoring of it. Whereas if a white person does it, there's going to be an entirely different reaction.
Yeah, there'll be a little bit of a culture thing, but
So
it's not going to be accepted from
even
the
if they
black
didn't
person.
say anything else, if the only thing they said was the N-word, more likely than not, you're going to
Sure.
get violence with the white person.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah. So then I think that establishes that regardless, like even when it comes to the hard R, when a black person says it versus a white person saying it, there's going to be all sorts of context and assumptions and presumptions that go into that usage just because of because of the race of the individual using it.
Potentially, because there's like a cultural expectation, and somebody that's willing to defy cultural expectation, even if the expectation is dumb, it's going to make people think like, wait, what's going on? Because
Right.
you're willing to defy
Right.
like an expectation. Yeah, of course.
So with that analogy, with that presumption that automatically happens, like with the Yamama thing, we making that analogy similar to the N-word, where it's like there is a presumption by the person using the word that there isn't this contextual hating or dehumanizing of the person, because to do that would be to dehumanize yourself.
Yeah.
So there is that realistic presumption, and we do this all the time. Like you gave an example. You mentioned, you said if a if you and your fiance, if you were making misogynist jokes or whatever,
She
you know,
knows
with
I
your
don't mean
fiance,
it because we've got a history and she knows, yeah.
yeah, but then you said if someone else was to do that, there wouldn't be that presumption to be like, oh, what are you
Exactly.
doing? In the same way, the N-word, if I'm saying something to another black person or just to anyone with the N-word in it, there is not this presumption of disdain, presumption of dehumanizing, and all these other things.
Yeah, with no history, I would probably generally default to assuming that, yeah.
Sure.
But I think
then
like if
we
you have
can
more
never
context in a
afford that.
situation, that's kind of what I feel like changes things.
Well, okay, which context would be added that would like undermine or kind of
Like I think if you've got like a group of black guys and a white friend and they all like grown up together, they live in the same block or whatever, and you know the white guy also said it along with the black guys, I don't think that for somebody external to that to look at that and be like, oh my god, this is so horrible. It just seems like, well, I don't know, is it? No one here seems to care.
well, I think it depends because I think for some people, like if you're going to do something within that in group, then it's probably best to keep it confined to that in group. And if someone else within the in group has an offense to something, then you don't do it. For example, my father hates the N word, hates it. That's not something I say to him. I spam it all day, right? But I don't say it in front of my dad. So we have the understanding that when my dad's around, we as a group don't say that because even though it's something that we have this shared oppression about or this presumption of whatever, like we know that it's offensive to him, and since it's offensive to him, then it's something that we avoid with
And
him.
I think that's totally fair when you're around your father. And I think that's respect that you afford him because that's somebody that you would make accommodations for because
Sure.
you love your dad, I'm assuming.
Of course.
Would it be fair for your dad to go to other areas and try to tell other people what they can or cannot say based on what he finds offensive? And are those other people obligated to respect his proclivities there?
So I think if my dad's in another location and somebody says something, then my dad can obviously voice to them, "Hey, I'm not a big fan of this
Let's say,
word, I
like,
don't do that."
hypothetically, let's say that you go to, like,
Well, hold on, let me finish it really quick.
Oh,
Let me
yeah,
finish it.
okay. Well, let's get an actual scenario, and then you can tell me.
Sure. All right,
Let's say
Mike.
you go to, like, a basketball court, okay?
Okay.
And there's, like, a bunch of black guys just playing ball or whatever, and you go to play. And then your dad overhears a conversation, like, on the other half of the court, and they're just calling each other, like, yo, good shot, ninja. Okay? And then your dad is like, hey, does he have a right to be like, hey, you guys need to not say that word while I'm here and I can hear it? Do you think he would do that? And then do you think he has a right to do that? And should they listen?
He'd probably be a lot more respectful in his delivery because you can't control other adults. So you
Sure.
probably ask more of an entreating thing, like an appeal to decency. Hey, could you guys not say that word around me? This is what happens all the time.
Okay.
And so then those people, they have a right to go ahead and say, well, I have freedom of speech, right? I can do whatever I want to do. Or they can sit there and say, you know, maybe it makes a little bit more sense for me to go ahead and respect what he's saying here. And they have a right. It's not a matter of right, it's a matter of decency, right? Because they can respect what my dad's request is, or they can just choose to say, I don't care about how you feel about it, which is inherently disrespectful.
Sure. But I don't think it's necessarily horrible to be disrespectful. I think that depending on like the context in the area, I think it's fair to speak how you want. So like if I was playing basketball, which I would never do because I'm fucking horrible at basketball.
Sure.
But if I was playing basketball like with my son at like the park and there were other kids or families there, I would probably moderate my language quite a bit because like there are kids, there's an expectation here, right? But if we were going to like the gym or something, or maybe to another area where it's more like adult focused or whatever, and I'm like, you know, I'm swearing or something. Like if somebody comes out and like, hey, can you not swear here? I probably would because I'm a respectful person in real life. But like also, I could understand being like, no, you know what? Like if you don't like this, like go somewhere else. Like I can talk with the way that I want with my kid or any friends here. Like if you're so upset by this, like go somewhere else. Like you don't have a
Sure.
right to police me here.
So yeah, so it really does boil down to, I guess, a matter of decency. Because in the same sense, a person could be like doing some PDA. It doesn't have to be particularly ridiculous, but just someone displaying PDA. Someone has a kid there, you can be mindful, and right, and it's a respectful, decent thing to do, to say, you know, I'll probably like hold some of this back, pull back on some of this in front of these children. Same with language. I can choose to do that. But regardless, you have a right to do PDA in front of other people. But again, it's about decency and order and respect. So in the same sense, no one can ever tell that white person in that group with those other black people that he doesn't have the right to say the word because it's freedom of speech. But it is indecent. It is disrespectful. And I don't think it's an unfounded disrespect. I do think there might be certain situations where it's like, hey, like you can go into someone else's space, like in someone else's home, And then like trying to tell them or control what they're doing, it becomes a little bit more ridiculous. Although even still you can make appeals there. For example, if I'm going to someone else's house and they're like about to light up a blunt in front of me, I can ask them, hey, could you not smoke that while I'm here, right? And they can choose to say, sure, I'll respect that. Or they can choose to say, I don't respect that because this is my house and I have a right.
And I
right?
think that's fair. And I think we can get into the weeds on like what's a respectful request versus like what's a disrespectful request. If I'm at a park with my kid, I can probably ask somebody, could you not swear? If I'm at like a baseball game, I probably can be like, hey, can you guys stop swearing up there? Because it's like, well, what is the expectation? And we would probably mostly agree on that. I think the part that we get into like more of a disagreement on is like, well, what are the ramifications of if you decide to ignore somebody's request? Because if you're going to say like, well, that makes you like a little bit rude, I can buy that. But that's not the problem when we talk about certain words, is that it makes you like racist or horrible. And I will say, like, as somebody that grew up, and this is kind of the frustration for talking about this this word so much, is the frustration growing up is there was one word that I heard growing up that actually made me so uncomfortable. And it's more uncomfortable than when I hear people say the N-word. And maybe this was just in a conservative household. But listening to a lot of Fox News and a lot of conservative talk show hosts, the word that I heard that made me really uncomfortable was thug. Because when somebody said thug, they meant black person every time. And they meant it like the worst way possible. And that was always like, but I don't think you would ever get in trouble. People would be like, oh, that's a little bit.
You thought that was worse than the N-word?
Well, yeah, because like, well, in terms of like hearing like two white guys call each other the N-word or somebody like rapping to a song, like thug was basically like the white version of the N-word for at least like the 90s and early 2000s.
Sure.
That's what you always said, thug or gangster or hoodlum, like things that you would say to talk about black people without saying the N-word or black people.
Sure. And I think this is a perfect example of why these two words are so incredibly different. And I think this also contributes to why there's such gatekeeping, right? Because when you can look at something from your perspective, having watched these shows and hearing someone say thug and almost equating that with the N-word, whereas black people would never even come close to that. I can't think of a black person on the planet that would say that it's equivalent. Now,
Not equivalent, but I bet if they heard a white person say something like that, they'd
bad.
know what they were talking about.
Well,
right?
sure, but if we're not going to like live in some like binary world in which like it's just bad or good, then we're going to have to recognize that there's degrees to these things, and the N-word is probably 3 times as potent as the word thug, even from the worst intending individuals. And it could be offensive, it could be problematic, but there's so much more contextualization that goes behind the word, the N-word, that would probably resonate significantly stronger with black people. And I think there is always this attempt, like, or not always, I'll just say this. It seems like very often when you start getting into the weeds of the conversation surrounding this word, that you'll find through like that plenty of people start having these things where it demonstrates that they don't fully understand the word. For example, when someone starts saying, oh, the N-word is similar to cracker, and it's like, clearly these two words are not the same. Or you had people saying things like Karen is equivalent to the N-word. Clearly these things aren't the same.
Equivalent, no, but similar in usage sometimes, I think so.
Well, I mean, again, it's incredibly reductive. I mean, but similar in usage that it's just derogatory. I
No,
guess
similar
the word
in
stupid
usage
would
in
be.
that we're trying to find some characteristic that in and of itself shouldn't be bad, but we're going to make you feel bad for it, and the insult's going to revolve around it.
Okay, there's that, and that is not at all what the N-word is, because the N-word wasn't focused on a characteristic necessarily. The N-word was something that was, again, like just completely dehumanizing of the individuals, whereas Karen was something that was a reaction to, it was
Well, let's
it was
to be
focused
clear.
on the
Well,
action.
the N-word wasn't about individuals. It was.
I'm sorry, it was
characteristic.
about the entire group.
Yeah,
right.
of black people. That
right.
was the
Whereas
characteristic.
Karen and Karen, while it was predominantly used against white people, we see people using Karen against black people. We see people using it against Hispanic people. We also see.
Oh, I don't think Karen is as much like a racial insult. I think that sometimes it gets a little sexist. Where anytime a woman complains about anything, people start to call her Karen immediately, and it's like, well, hold on, wait, doesn't she have like legitimate complaint?
But I think the very big difference between Karen and the N-word is that for no matter what, we didn't automatically assume that all white people or all women were Karens. It was only specific women that had specific actions and specific traits, whereas N-word was something that was universally applied just to black people for them being black. And so I think those two things are different. You can be a woman and not be a Karen. During certain times in history, no matter who you were, if you were a person, if you were a black person, you were the N-word.
Sure, historically speaking,
Extremely different.
I understand that we can get like ultra academic in terms of like historically like how are these words.
That's not academic.
But in
that's
well, so like here's like the issue. Okay, at the end of the day, I was working at my apartment gym like 3 weeks ago. Okay, and like 2 white guys came in, and very clearly they wanted to be gangsters. Okay, they had like the droopy pants that you drew or whatever. One guy was like working out. He has his phone blaring, some dumb shit or whatever. And another guy comes in and he sees him. He's like, "What's up, ninja?" And they're both very fucking white. Okay, we're just like, who the fuck cares? Who cares?
Black people care.
Why?
That's who. I think because, again, I think for black people to have experienced something and have done something, it's not very common to like reclaim a word and use it in a positive way for themselves to make sure that, like, I guess to kind of disempower the word to some degree.
Which it has been.
Yeah, for sure, dramatically.
But if it's been defanged, then who cares if people use it?
But it's only partially it's not fully there. And I think it's defanged and I'm sorry, it's partially defanged, right? So when you experience it, like I think I think there's a matter of like looking at it and recognizing that a person's willingness to like kind of like forego these like social expectations, I think is problematic. But it's not because of it's not because the word itself has all the power.
It's just because you defy the social expectations. So
Right.
I don't necessarily disagree with this line of argument. Well, I do, but I can understand the internal consistency. But if you want to maintain the consistency of this, we have to get rid of it in the music. Because
No.
how weird is it that there's like a guy in the gym with his fucking cell phone speaker on, playing music that has the N-word in it, and he's listening to it, but he can't like say that to a person next to him. That's like, I feel like we have to go through very crazy mental gymnastics to try to find a way where, well, it's okay that he's listening to it and playing it for other people to hear, but he's not saying it exactly. And even though it's meant in a certain way there and he means it in a certain way, it's still bad if he says it. It just feels like so bizarre.
I don't find that particularly bizarre. But just to be clear here, so we
Uh-huh.
are establishing first point. One is obviously very distinct from like the Karen word. Obviously, it's very.
They're all
very
different
distinct
words, yeah, of course.
But I mean, it's substantively distinct.
There's
from
more,
these words.
I don't know if I say substance, but there's far more gravity there. It's like, obviously, like,
Obviously,
Yeah.
And I think when people try to equate these words, then I feel like that's part of the reasoning, or that in itself is probably indicative of a lack of understanding of how this word has felt.
potentially. But
Well,
I don't think people
I
try to
feel like it has
equate
to
the
be.
words. I think people just try to say that, like, if we should avoid certain classes of... The N-word is not a special class in and of itself. We can put the N-word there with other types of slurs, other types of racial slurs, and maybe other types of, like, gender or
You can,
sexual
because
slurs.
we tend to group things, but like obviously in degree and severity, the N word is significantly outweighing literally
might
any
be
other word you
worse,
can
but if
put
it's still in the same
in a
class.
class with it.
Nobody outside of, like, a classroom is going to understand this highly intellectualized reason of
That's
why
not true
you can't use the
whatsoever.
N-word, but we can use, like, any other racial slur. I don't think you can
No,
do
but
that.
most people aren't even arguing that you can use other racial slurs.
Sure.
But we are arguing specifically that these things are worse. And again, I don't think it takes a classroom for somebody to identify the N word is significantly worse than Karen. The N word is significantly worse than cracker. The N word is significantly worse than literally any slur. However, no, that's just it. Like, I don't think it takes a classroom for that. I think
Worse,
most people
for
have
sure,
understood
more
that.
gravity, but not in a class of its own.
Sure, I guess it depends on how specific you want to get with the class.
Mm-hmm.
But again, putting something within a class when there's a spectrum of things is probably a little bit more intelligent. And again, I don't think that takes a classroom. For example, you can have incredibly high functioning autism, right? Which I think at one point they used to call like Asperger's or something. And sure, you can say Asperger's is in the same class as other mental disorders. But clearly, if you want to start talking about something like MR, then it starts mental retardation. It starts getting significantly worse, right? Like these things are like a high functioning autistic person and a mentally retarded person. They're incredibly different. So while you can say, yes, they're in the same class, in order to say that, it feels reductive because you're almost eliminating the fact that this word is something specific, something way more vitriolic, way more harmful, and it has a
If you-
unique classification in the sense
Sure.
that it has been, because it was so uniquely hurtful, that the fact that people are reclaiming that word and making it something more positive is something unique
You
in
can say that, but
almost in
like
itself.
it feels like today the harm is just culturally reinforced. That's where the majority of like the shock value comes from. Is because we
The harm was
culturally
always
reinforce it.
culturally reinforced. The
No,
harm behind
hold on.
wait, the harm behind any word is going to be culturally enforced.
The harm behind the N-word wasn't just that it was culturally bad. It's that you had an entire power structure of white people owning slaves.
Sounds like you're talking about culture.
When I say culturally reinforced, I'm talking about like today it's bad not because slave owners are calling slaves the N-word or because white people are constantly running around like, I hate N-words, blah, blah, blah. It's just like a cultural thing. We're like, well, this is bad because it's bad and we know it should be bad, but not for like there's not the same power structure that existed, 200 years ago that made it really, really bad.
Sure. Okay, so I guess like pointing out that maybe the life circumstances of individuals who would be the recipients.
It's
of such
gotten
a
less
word-
bad over time, is what I would say. Is that okay?
I disagree.
Okay, so how can we say if it hasn't gotten any less bad, then why the fuck do black people use it? Maybe then they just shouldn't do it anymore. Because the defanging and the taking it back clearly doesn't work. Then,
You're
right.
I'm wrong there. It
Okay,
has
that's
obviously
fine.
gotten. It
Sure.
obviously has.
It's still like the
contradicting
worst,
myself.
and
Right.
it's still up there for sure.
Right.
But
And-
it's not. It doesn't have quite the sting anymore.
Sure. That's. I mean, there's no way around that.
Like
that's
whereas my
literally the
guess would
purpose
be
of it,
like
yeah.
100 years ago, if you heard a white person call somebody an N-word in a restaurant, like I'm just gonna totally guess most of the black people would probably be really uncomfortable.
Sure.
But nowadays, if you hear a white person call somebody the N-word in a restaurant, even black people are probably looking around like, the fuck, this guy's crazy. And it's almost like funny because of how stupid, assuming you're not like in the South or something, right? About how crazy or insane this white person is saying the N-word. It's going to be like a, it's
Like
going to
you're
be
talking about hard R?
yeah.
I don't
it's
think
going to
any
be like a,
people would-
I'm not saying it's going to be like not comfortable, but I'm saying that like it's going to be like way more lighthearted in how people are going to
I don't
be
think
around.
it'd be. We looked at like.
Hold on, I'm going to be more absolute here. I am absolutely right here. 100 years ago, hearing the hard R in a restaurant, I think would have made the average black person way more afraid than hearing it today, where people are probably more likely to pull out their cell phones and be like, look at this crazy dude losing his mind.
Well, sure. Well, so first off, I mean, I think like the idea that it's like lighthearted. I don't think that it would be lighthearted. I think maybe I'm just having. I'm kind of taking exception with some of the phrases specifically that you're saying.
Sure.
It's not going to be lighthearted. What it's going to be is most likely, again, because the word has like gotten like less vitriolic or it has been defanged to some degree. I think people are a lot of times just gonna. Some people are just gonna say, "I'm rising above this." Right? We're in a different state where a lot of people have a lot of self-love, self-acceptance, and so on and so forth, and an acknowledgement that a person saying that like you just don't have the same respect for them. It was different when you felt like you were already subjugated and you viewed a person somewhat better than you. But I think respect for an insult is only as strong as the respect for the individual who issued it. Right? Like
No, I don't agree
to
with that.
some
But
degree.
go
For
ahead.
example,
I totally
like,
disagree, but go ahead.
well, for say some MR person calls me stupid. It's like, doesn't really sting very much because like you're the one, whatever. Or say somebody that I have like literally zero respect for says something like, I think you're some whatever insult. Then if I don't respect a person, it's very easy for me to like kind of like dismiss that. It's significantly more easy to dismiss that for a person I have no respect for than it is for that to come from a person that I actually respect. Do you disagree with that?
Yeah. I think that for some insults, I think that can be the case. But I think that 100 years ago, there was a more unifying black experience in the United States where you were directly engaged with like a struggle against like the white state. You literally
that
had
struggle is part of that respect.
well, I guess, but that's not unique to the individual. Like any white person could theoretically wield that power over any black person,
Because
whether you
even in
respected the white person or not.
Because even in the worst circumstances, it was like pretty universally accepted that white people were like
Better than black people, right?
That
yeah.
was like that was the structure, the structural powers almost like not almost directly deemed it so. Where you can't live in a white neighborhood.
Yeah, you can't go to a white
own
school,
property,
you can't go to a white
drink
water
from this
fountain.
fountain.
Yeah, for
you
sure.
can't- So then, because of that, there was already like a system enforced respect. So then, at that point, it's really hard to like almost contend with the point that I'm making that the respect for an insult is depending on the respect for the individual who's issuing it. Because in this situation, there was a culturally and systematically enforced respect.
So I'm saying that like
there,
the
so this
N-word kind
doesn't
of like
apply.
went along. It was riding the same wave as that institution, basically. Whereas today, it feels like a lot different in that that wouldn't be like a socially accepted thing, probably almost anywhere in the country. So if you were to hear it, it's not just like oh man, like there's another like white guy sitting on the top of the power hierarchy that's like reinforcing my separation from society. It's more like who's this crazy motherfucker in the restaurant saying the N-word? Like this dude is insane. Time to start recording and post it on Facebook because this guy's crazy.
I think that pretty often those situations are not going to be just a matter of, this person is crazy. Some people are going to be directly offended, and some people are going to get violent. Remember the Twisted Tea situation that happened with that dude, where the white guy kept calling him the N-word, and eventually he busted the Twisted Tea over that dude's head? Or like when Popeyes came out with their chicken sandwich, and people were like fighting, and there was some like tensions, and then all of a sudden somebody called a person the N-word. That person responded and got incredibly violent. I think it was someone pointed out. I didn't actually see this video, but there was a panel when we were having this discussion, and someone said, there was a old white guy that called someone the N-word, and then he got punched in his face and was killed by the punch, right? So I think the idea that like, yes, there are some people. I'm one of those people. Somebody calls me the hard R. Am I going to be truly like offended? I'm going to be offended,
For
but
sure.
I don't think it's probably going to have as much weight because then it's just like I don't know. I think I'm probably better than that person. Like as a human
Yeah, I
being.
understand.
So, but I can still recognize that this thing is incredibly harmful, and I don't think I would be looking at it lightheartedly. It would probably be a response that I think is the proper response, while not being emotionally invested. And I think that's where where I feel like black people as a whole, plenty of us have risen emotionally to the point that these things aren't nearly as catastrophic, but they still have a significant like mental weight that we probably give due diligence.
Wouldn't it just be way easier if we just didn't care that much about it? And then we just like, when people were racist, we got mad at them for being racist instead of saying words that they hear in like music that they're inundated with 24/7.
That was a problem. That was a problem earlier. When you were saying that, immediately we assume that the person is racist. I don't know that's the case. Sometimes it's not even a matter of assuming that the person is racist. Sometimes it's just a matter of recognizing that this is something that is unacceptable, that we've like deemed is culturally wrong, and you're doing this thing. You're violating. That's a violation. And it doesn't matter. And it doesn't necessarily mean that you're racist. It could just mean that you're violating this cultural expectation that we have from you, and that's offensive. I don't. Yeah. Do you think that that's realistically more?
If
common?
people believe that, I would be way more okay with that. I would think it's
no
dumb.
one believes that?
I think it's way more people that could be like, that guy's racist.
Well, I think a lot of times people are willing.
I've had people call me racist if I post a meme where one of the guys says like the soft A in the meme. People like, Destiny just used the N word. I'm like,
I can't really answer for people on Twitter,
sure,
but
and I
will say,
understand. It's not fair. I'm not making
and again, I really want to say that more often than not, people are going to be likely to call someone a racist, not just because they said the N word, but because we have such a very clearly defined cultural expectation that you won't be saying this. And so if we know this is something that won't be done, we know that this is like the easiest indicator of someone being racist because we've made this so culturally defined, and you're choosing to do that, then I think, yeah, you could probably rest in the assumption that a person that was willing to use this word in a harmful way is probably racist. I think it's more likely than not. However, I think the offense isn't just because a person is racist. We're aware that people are racist all the time. But normally the reaction is to the violation.
sure, if somebody acts like that, I'm more agreeable to that, even though I would still push against it than the person thinking the other person's racist. But sure.
Oh, sure.
I understand what you're saying.
I would totally agree with you that you can't immediately assume that a person is racist just because they said the N word.
Sure.
It doesn't necessarily follow that a person is racist. But
Okay.
I don't think that's the offense. Do you agree with me? For sure. Just want to make sure this is crystal clear, that the N word is absolutely not equivalent, even if it's in the same class, that there's a significantly higher degree between the N word and the word cracker.
Yeah, but almost for sure, yeah.
Okay. And same with like pretty much the vast
But
majority
I
of
think that
racial
like
slurs.
if somebody doesn't want to be called something, I think that they're all racist. But like obviously one is worse than the other, for sure.
I agree. I think a person like willingly just like labeling white people in general as something like cracker is obviously going to be, it's just as harmful. And I think if you're starting to like use these labels which have these racial intents, it is indicative of some sort of like personal belief.
Sure.
And so okay, so then these two things are incredibly distinct. And so this, I guess we probably got to get into, we'll take a small break if we can. But I think the piece specifically about black artists and black music, I think that part,
Okay.
I mean, I don't know, you know, I'm a musician and I followed a lot of black music all my life and black artists and specifically. And I collected just a few examples of different black artists and their kind of takes on, their takes on various issues. And I just think that's something that we need to discuss.
Sure.
Alrighty.